Jennifer, thank you. And that was a very generous introduction. And it's great to be with all of you. And I love the energy around the startups. And I hope what you get out of this is a way to make your startup more impactful, more successful. You see, my friends, we have what I call a trillion.
I'm going to let you go do your keynote and get off and come back in about 20, 25 minutes. So go for it. Getting off stage here.
Hello, everybody. And it's so great to be with you and to share some of our lessons that we've learned here about how to make your technology and your startups more impactful. You see, we have a $1 trillion problem in our healthcare system in the US. We looked at defects in value, that is things that we should be doing to give high value care, but we don't, and so they result in a decrement in the value that we provide. And we've added those up across the country, and what we found is that leads to $1.4 trillion in waste. $1.4 trillion in waste. We also know that preventable harm is the third leading cause of death in America, at least. Add misdiagnosis, and it's probably the top cause. And about a third of patients leave their interaction with healthcare feeling they were disrespected, they weren't listened to, and they're scared about what to do next. And finally, we have morally unacceptable high health inequities that for virtually anything you look at, our health outcomes and our access vary by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation. And so the question is, why, despite all our investment in technology, all the brilliant startups that I'm probably pitched 15 of them a week, does this persist? Not only that, healthcare is unique amongst industries that spend heavily on technology and have negative labor productivity. Let me just give an example of how negative it really is. A hospital like the size of UH or Johns Hopkins, these 1,000-bed hospitals, 20 years ago, they were largely staffed in the 2,200 FTEs, same number of beds. Today, those same hospitals are staffed with usually in the range between 11 and 12,000 FTEs, right? It's absurd, that lack of productivity. There's no other industry that even comes close to that. And by the way, we've spent billions or hundreds of billions of dollars on technology that is supposed to help us. So why does that $1 trillion problem exist? And what could you do about it? Or how might we go about doing about it? Well, my friends, I believe that innovation has nowhere near achieved the impact that it could have. Indeed, just so we're clear, my definition of innovation is ideas with impact. That the way we go about doing innovation is wrong, that it's not working, and we need to think through a new way. And let me share with you some of the things that I see. So often we think the barrier to innovation is capital, and we spend all our time doing capital or pitching about how great our technology is. Well, my view is being the recipient, both an innovator and who's pitched many, many times a day, capital is rarely the barrier. There's plenty of capital. And technology, despite that you have good stuff, is frankly a commodity, right? What the technology that healthcare is using today is often a decade old in other industries, or it may be being used in healthcare, but the differentiator between an ML model or much of what we're doing, sure, sometimes there's some really disruptive technologies, but it's almost always an analog or imported from another industry. Like we're doing some really cool stuff with asset tracking, but that comes from UPS or other industries that just hadn't been imported to healthcare. So what are the barriers? Well, my friends, I would share with you a couple key ones. The first is, what problem are you solving, right? Rarely when I pitch something could I hear, this is the problem I'm going to solve, and even more specifically, how I will add value. See, the days of supporting what I would call innovation theatrics. I have a new idea, I develop some app or some widget, and somehow I think people are going to buy that because it's really cool, but we haven't been clearly to say what's the problem we're going to solve and how does what you're going to do help address that. Second reframing that we need to do is, if capital and technology aren't the barrier, what is? Well, I'll tell you the major barrier, and it will be true with every one of your tech, is usability and fitting it into the workflow. Usability and fitting into the workflow. The vast majority of the tech that I look at say, kind of cool idea, but I can tell you, you've never tested it in a workflow. It'll flop. Like, interesting idea, no way in hell it's going to scale, right? And what you need, you can't solve that usability issue yourself. You need a provider partner, and a true partner, that we align incentives with that partner, and that they co-design with you what that usability is. We'll share some examples of how that works, but there's literally at the elbow connection, working together, agile development, so that we can deploy it in a usable way. That takes effort on both of our parts. The next barrier that I'd like to share is the lack of systems engineering or integration. What I mean by that is, apps are not going to solve this $1 trillion problem, right? And what we've done is proliferate apps, and everybody makes their own hardware and software. So what am I dealt with now? I have, literally everybody comes with a disease-specific platform or technology. Here's my diabetes thing. Here's my heart failure thing. Here's my blood pressure thing. Here's my narcotic thing. Here's my patient-centered stuff. Okay, great. What other industry has solved big problems by this whack-a-mole approach? They haven't. They've all used disciplined systems engineering, where they align around a problem, in this case, optimizing value for we serve, and design solutions that are integrated to achieve that value. We're at the healthcare stage are still at the whack-a-mole of one little app may make a difference, but almost every time I'm pitched something, the light bulbs go off and say, if you connected with this other person who's doing this, this cool thing, or you connected with these two things, boy, you really have something that is transformative for value. Again, I'll share with you some examples of how we indeed are doing that, but we haven't had that ecosystem of collaborators, and then this integration into a system as a system engineering mindset. The final barrier, and believe me, I get it, you're all probably suffering this all the time, is how do I get my first 10 customers? Because selling in healthcare is really, really hard, and the cycle time is long. And how do you get someone's attention? And even when someone like myself is pitched many different apps or technologies that, as I said, fundamentally, without any disrespect to yours, they don't look all that different. The tech is largely a commodity. So how do I differentiate who is going to win or lose? How do I select one? And you're dealing with people who are really, really busy. There's no rating system for the most part of how you might address that. So let me share with you a story that we just did at UH with COVID that shows you how this ecosystem could really, really work well. I had developed a mobile platform for remote monitoring that was a mobile-based technology that can ingest any sensor data and give patients alerts, and they can communicate with their loved ones. We didn't have a sensor data, but it was bought by Massimo. I have no ongoing financial interest at all with Massimo, but they're a great sensor company. They make probably the world's best pulse oximeter, and they were going to make a disposable pulse oximeter that they could share with this Datella device. And I had lost track of them over about a year and a half, but COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we were inundated with hospital volumes then, and tragically we're just as bad or even worse today. And everyone was struggling of how do you build capacity for these patients that were coming in? How do we protect our staff and conserve PPE? And how do we keep chronically ill patients out of the hospital so they're not exposed to risk? So very, very key problems. And around the country, you may have seen people stood up command centers and field hospitals that, if you looked at the pictures, ironically, they look no different than a 1919 field hospital. There isn't any system engineering thinking in them. So we said, well, most people have a home. They have a bed. If we can monitor that home, we've just created almost infinite capacity to care for these people if we can do it safely. Moreover, if we can monitor chronically ill people and have them not come into the hospital, that doesn't even expose them, and that will further build capacity for the people who need the ICU bed, and it saves PPE and it saves exposure risks. So I called Massimo's CEO March 16th, said, Joe, hey, did you ever build that pulse ox that syncs with Doctella? Because boy, we could really use it now. And he said, well, we did submit an FDA application, but it was for using it for narcotic monitoring, not for COVID. And I said, well, let's schedule an emergent call at the FDA to see if we can get emergency approval. We really need this. The country, the world needs this. So we scheduled it 2 days later, March 18th, and do a call at the FDA, explain the need, gets emergency approval. Their engineers and our clinical team literally spend 4 or 5 hours a day working out use cases for the next 4 days. They're on Zoom. Our clinicians are mocking up what are the workflows, who we're going to put this on, how will it be deployed, who's going to be monitoring them in the command center, what are the decision rules that we'll be using in the command center, how are we going to call them, what the dashboard will look like, what those alerts are going to look on the dashboard. Literally every step of the process between identifying a patient who needs a technology, how to hook it up, how to train the staff to do it, how to have them go home, how to get the data flowing so we have a command center, what our interventions are, how do we problem solve. 4 days later, from FDA approval, we launched our first patient. 4 days. Think about that rapid innovation. This was not previously FDA approved. We continued to do twice daily scrums where the Massimo engineers, our clinical teams are, literally doing several hour iteration where this was a brand new product. So the dashboard wasn't even built, and the initial products didn't look good. The first batteries that they had defects in them. And so we had really short battery life that our staff was having to go deploy batteries, but we identified that. They fixed that in their manufacturing. Like, in doing your startup, scores of little tweaks that make the product usable, because without those, clinicians would have thrown it away, because the battery life at first was supposed to last 4 to 6 days. It was lasting a day, if that. We're getting calls for more batteries. And many things like that would have sabotaged it had we had not this usability, our team and their team at the elbow iterating it. A month after our first patient, we hosted a global webinar with WHO, because this is a global need for monitoring. We had people from 75 countries. We had about 3,000 health systems on it. And I think they are now over 1,000 customers or something using this device that was invented out of need, but it represents the ecosystem. What the last barrier that we had to address, that you're also going to have to address, is a payment model. You see, too often we don't think of that, especially with all these home monitoring explosions. But when we started this, the CMS requirement or mindset was home monitoring is for chronic disease, and therefore you have to be monitored 16 days to get paid. Well, we were monitoring on average for, generally at the most 8 days, because people got better after that. We didn't need that, but we weren't able to bill for it. So it meant they would not have a sustainable business model, because you have to cover, at least the cost of the device and the cost of the clinicians who are doing the monitoring. So we worked, and other people worked with CMS to say that makes no sense. This is a new use case. It's an acute monitoring for at home, and let's reduce the duration to 2 days. So instantly the market exploded, because now there's a way to get paid for this. Many other devices are doing this, and the technology is just exploding and iterating, which is what we want, because we want a marketplace where the technology that adds the most value wins. Fast forward that now, I mentioned about synergy. Well, what are we doing and how are we adding value? Well, we partnered with another startup called Agility that has some really interesting technology to give real-time analytics to guide decision supports. And so we're using that for managing clinical variation, but also throughput. And we ported that into a command center that they built. We've linked in this home monitoring data into our command center. We used another Cleveland company called Talus that integrates ventilator data with EMR data and gives real-time alerts if you're complying with lung protective ventilation. Let me just give you an example on that. Despite about $4 billion of NIH-funded research in lung disease, the only thing that reduces mortality is if you give people breaths that are small based on how tall they are, not on how much they weigh. But the ventilator doesn't know how tall you are. It doesn't see that data. That's in the EMR. But oops, we have a system where the EMR and the ventilator don't talk. They used to not be allowed to talk because of information blocking, ridiculous. So what this company does is they connect these, and they connect an infusion pump. So now we could write a simple rule when those data are connected in real time to say, is the person getting short breaths? This intervention, by the way, reduces mortality by an absolute amount of 10%, from 40 to 30%. And on average, Americans or patients receive it about 30% of the time. So 70% have a 10% higher mortality than they need to. Now we have real-time alerts on people's mobile phones to display exactly whether they're compliant. We're also partnering with a mobile device company now, because what we saw with COVID through the command center is as we change our guidelines and our protocols, sometimes multiple times a day, we store them in this archaic static view where people have to go to a website to go find them. And we hope that they do, but we need to push those things out on a mobile phone so people have real-time decision depth. So this ecosystem now of system engineering, a command center, with our team integrating a whole bunch of different startups or technologies that really add value to the future. The final stage of this now is not just to take this at one health system, but to create an alliance, a network of health systems that are committed to driving value. You see, though we need payment reform, the data is payment reform to date has done preciously little to improve value and bend the cost curve. We need to align incentives, but it's health systems leading the way, innovating with technologies like yours or the descriptions that I just described, who are driving that value. Let me share with you. You know, we waste 30% of our healthcare spending, and healthcare spending has been going up around 6% a year. And there's preciously few examples of people who could even slow that just to the inflation rate. In the last year, and this is a paper that's coming out in New England Journal Catalyst on December 16th, where we showed this $1 trillion problem, but we also showed at university hospitals, by making these defects visible, we reduced Medicare spend by 9%, unheard of. How did we do that? We used technology in our analytics system to make all of these defects visible, like people going to sniff instead of home. It's a defect. We reduced it by 32%. People staying too long in sniffs, reduced it by 27%. People getting readmitted to the hospital because they don't see their primary care enough. We titrated up the dose of primary care 140%, reduced readmissions 28%. And so the hopefulness that health systems, when they use these principles that we just described and partner with industry in this ecosystem, could truly bend the cost curve and give the kind of care that our patients deserve, that our providers desire, and the public and the payers are demanding. So with that, my friends, I think we're happy to go into some Q&A time, but I hope you've recognized that your technology will only work if you have great usability that fits a workflow, that you partner with providers to create that, and you think about connecting different technologies. And the work, Jennifer, that Plug and Play does is just so perfectly situated for this, because you are a big part of that ecosystem.
Great. Thanks for that provocative and inspiring talk. I'm so excited to see the progress. I do have some questions for you coming in. So you talk about these radical inefficiencies in the healthcare system, and we know that we have to create as an ecosystem, but where does a health system start? What I heard you say is that there are sort of these little things that can be addressed, but where does the health system start to do this? Let's say if they were interested in saying, yeah, I want to get on board with this kind of alliance and this kind of
Yeah, yeah,
approach.
right. Yes. So let me just, because I probably didn't go into the alliance enough. The alliance now would bring health systems who are committed to improving value, to making their value transparent, and to partner to learning from each other and with technologies to overcome those barriers. In other words, we would create, you could think of it almost like a venture build where there'd be some alliance to say, hey, we'll give you access to this health system to prototype it, align those incentives in a variety of ways with the tech company. The other members would be incentivized to be your first 10 customers because they're going to be partners in this alliance. And there's this feeding ecosystem. So where I go, Jennifer, is, and I'm happy to share with you, we have this framework of defects in value. And what we did was we literally put a dollar amount or a harm amount on where are we having defects in value. There are defects in preventative care, defects in helping people stay well, defects in helping people manage an acute condition. So let me give you an example of an innovation we did. We saw that for our behavioral health, and you could say the same thing for diabetes or any other disease, it was organized around providers' needs, not patients' needs, where we had preciously limited access to psychiatrists, and most patients went out without behavioral or access to it. But when we flipped it from the patient perspective, we found that 80% of patients' behavioral health needs could be met by a social worker in a practice. So we stood it up. We found the next 15% could be met by a teleconsult, what we call access clinic, which it's from 1 to 3 visits, not long-term care with the psychiatrist, where they make a diagnosis or confirm the primary care diagnosis, recommend a treatment plan, and send you back to primary care. The patients like it because they don't pay 2 different doctors. And we've treated now like 95% of our patients in a way that we would have never thought. And now all we need is that last 5% who might need longer term care from a psychiatrist or substance misuse team to go about that. Let me give you another example, Jennifer. In addition to the clinical things, I mentioned healthcare has negative labor productivity. Indeed, it's the only piece. I can share with you, you were Google, I published a piece in Health Affairs, it was a Health Affairs blog, about 4 or 5 simple things that each waste 20% of a nurse's time. 20%. One of the ones we're working on now with my colleagues, Kip Lee and many of our colleagues at Ventures, are nurses spend 24% of their time hunting for supplies. Think about that. I mean, like, they're the most expensive part of our labor force. It's disrespectful of them. And I don't know if there's any nurses in the audience. Every time I mention it, nurses chuckle, say, yeah, that's my life. There's no signaling where supplies are stocked. And so I just walk around to see if my medicine came up. And there's hoarding behavior. So we have a shortage often of infusion pumps. So nurses hide them or they have to go walk and find them. And so that's a tractable problem that, we are now deploying a technology from a non-healthcare company called Trackology that has essentially a piece of tape that you can put on any asset. It uses a variety of technologies, but that we now know where these assets are real time. So what I would say is go to the Gemba, like they say in Toyota, or go to the work and ask people, where are you having problems, where your defects in value are.
And then the coordination on the hospital side comes from the chief clinical transformation office. Where does the coordination on the hospital?
Yeah, so you make it, that's a great point, because if you think about this, you're really creating an ecosystem or coordination of a tech company, the frontline clinicians who do this, but they're generally not in a position to manage it or do the contracting. So someone like the people in Ventures, someone like myself, which we obviously work, literally on the phone daily with them, and begin to coordinate to say, okay, what's that arrangement that we both get value, right? And those arrangements completely vary from, okay, if a startup, they may have capital, but maybe they'll give some equity. If it's a more mature company, there might be some, percent of sales. It all varies, but you're right. It's kind of this triangle of, an executive or a manager, the tech, and then really importantly, the frontline clinicians. And then, Jennifer, I would ask, I would say also that executive could also be a really disciplined provide the discipline of the product management, or get someone else. But like that Massimo example, literally I called twice, meetings twice a day. Both groups had assignments to say, yes, okay, our engineering team will go, reconfigure this, we'll get it back. And they were accountable for it. Obviously the Massimo people didn't report to me, but it was this great ecosystem where, and actually for most of the calls, their CEO and I were co-hosting it. So their engineers knew they had to deliver, our team knew they had to deliver, and we were in it together.
Right, and that gets to your issue about using Agile. And someone asked this question in the Q&A, but you kind of just answered it, is the importance of this experimentation along the journey. And what you're saying is it has to be Agile, it has to be at the elbow, it has to be tweaked constantly with these 2 meetings a day.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and if you think about, all the challenges we have with the EMR, and not that we didn't need to digitize, but the reality is, the main thing that we bought for EMRs is clinician burnout. I mean, there's really limited apparent data that patients are safer, our cost is down. But the reason was, it was the antithesis of Agile, right? These companies built something and said, doctor, you will design your workflow, or nurse, around how I want my workflow. And clinicians said, but that's not my workflow, right? It doesn't fit. No, you will use it this way. And so I think this Agile is the only way to make it work, because no matter how thoughtful you are in designing a product, when it hits the real world, you will learn things 10x more than you ever thought of before.
Right. I want to ask one more hospital related question, then we're going to get to questions on startups. But this one is that you said hospital systems need to work together to develop, apply, realize the benefits of the technology. But how willing do you believe that the U.S. health system is to work together? Because it says that the operating models and likely consolidate as a result, because there could be some consolidation. And the example that this person gives is that the number of U.S. commercial banks dropped from 20,000 in 1990 to 5,000 today. So that concept of hospitals working together.
Yeah, so really insightful question. Let me just give you some examples of the consolidation that I believe we will come if we eliminate these defects in value. Right now, probably 50 to 60% of people who go to nursing homes shouldn't be going there. They don't need it. 50% of people in emergency departments do not need to be there. 40% to 50% of medical admissions do not need to be there. Literally, just think about half of your medical admissions, if we provided the ambulatory care, and probably 30 to 40% of surgeries should be done in a non-hospital setting. So you're right. As we get good at reducing these defects, healthcare, hospital, particularly platform, is going to go down. And I don't know that I'm right. I think hospitals in communities like Cleveland are collaborating now like they never have before because of COVID. But there's obviously challenges outside of a pandemic. The view for the Value Alliance that I have is that we would carefully select hospitals or systems that don't compete in various geographic regions, because I think it would be too much of a barrier. And there may be some overlap, but the members are going to have to be comfortable having other people in this, so they really collaborate. And I can share with you, my colleagues around the country are jazzed about this idea, because they all know their current model for innovation isn't working. I mean, it hasn't been the cost curve. It hasn't helped productivity. It hasn't helped employer and clinician well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. There are so many questions around the hospital, but I did want to give a chance to talk about startups. I'm going to put a couple of questions together here. First of all, what do you do as a startup when you're the one who has that one little app? Number one, and then what's the best front door to use as a startup to come to the hospital, to engage with the hospital?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we see this all the time. And it's this tension, because many of these apps are really important ideas, and they're, niche solutions. But the question, what do I do with that, right? Am I really going to get funding for a sales force? And, to build, it's one thing. And I think the software development and the SKD kits, that's often not the barrier, but selling to healthcare, to hospitals, is really, really difficult. Indeed, I know several venture firms, if you can believe it, whose entire business model is they look for tech startups that died because they couldn't sell, but the underlying idea was good. They buy them really cheap and they put a sales force around it. And so, and there's several companies like that who that's their whole business model. So I would say a couple things. I would connect in the hospital first with a clinician who is you're helping them solve the problem that they have, because they'll give you insights into are you on target, how you make it work better, and you'll see if they're willing to use it in their own practice is probably the best testament. So that's often some development, and then that clinician could be the insider who helps drive it to to get it accepted. There's some cautions, or at least I would say, is that oftentimes if you give equity or you have some financial relationship with that clinician, they understandably are excluded from being involved in that decision making to bring your tech into an ecosystem, and they have to obviously be mindful of how well they do it. And so my sense is, at least initially, until you get a product that you're willing to sell, is kind of stall on any kind of equity for them, because then they're really tied their hands. And if they're passionate about what they want to do, they're going to help push that technology. The on the private sector side, I think app companies, and plug and play, Jennifer, this is something you guys can do, or you do, create an ecosystem to say, okay, well, maybe I'm going to potentially connect with an analog company who has some adjacent pieces that I see there's accretive value if they do this, but I'm not going to have to fund a sales force, right? Or to get something. I also think companies, like Premier, that are big GPOs that sell to a large number of hospitals, and could be an avenue for getting your word out there.
Right, great. And then one final question quickly. How do we address the reimbursement issue? You talked about it a little bit, but the question is, based on the ways that reimbursement works, healthcare systems often do not receive credit for improvements in efficiency, and in fact, improvements sometimes lower their revenues. And I think one of the best examples is with telehealth, right? We went to telehealth, and then you don't get reimbursed at the same rate. So what incentive does a hospital have to continue to use that? Can you address that for a second?
Yeah, Jennifer, really, really good question. And one of the reasons why I said I don't think government is going to solve this value problem, though we need to align incentives, is the payment policy that they're doing is what I would call macro policy. So what's bundle payments, or we're going to go to capitation. But as you know, within that bundle or in that macro payment policy, there's scores of little payment policies that, if changed, could drive value, but they're barriers. Now, prior to COVID, CMS hasn't really been willing to do these micro targeting things. But what many of us had communicated with them is to say, we need to start thinking about what are those little defects in payment policies that preclude barrier. Let me give you an example. CMS used to require that you're homebound to get home health care, right? And it made no sense. It made sense when they were worried about fraud for home health care. But now we could frankly give ICU level care with home health nurses. We can give physical therapy. So because of that payment policy, if a patient needed antibiotics, right, or think now remdesivir or some IV infusion, we would send them to a nursing home, which is much more expensive and riskier for them rather than home, because if they went home, they'd have to pay for it out of their pocket.
Right.
But with COVID, CMS revised that requirement. And again, they had their eyes open to say, wow, not only is it good for patients, but we're not going to get the SNF spend. They changed that home monitoring in part because we said, so if you don't change it, we're going to admit these people to the hospital. It's 20 times more expensive, at least, than what you're going to get at home. And so what I think you need to do, and we all need to do, is think mindfully about how you're going to get paid, but then be really macro, lazily focused about what is that payment barrier that would incentivize value or innovation, and pitch CMS just like you would pitch, a VC company to say, here's the current parent payout policy, here's the unintended consequences, here's what we would propose, how it would stimulate, care in a higher value setting and would stimulate innovation to further improve this. And then importantly, think about, and what are the protections against overuse, right? But for the most part, the risk of overuse is 2 log orders less than the value of getting people out of the hospital into these lower cost settings.
Right, great. Well, thank you so much. I suspect that as the Alliance progresses, we're going to have to bring you back on because we had a lot of questions and people were really interested. Thank you so much for this wonderful keynote, provocative and insightful. And it's been a pleasure, Dr. Pronovost, to have you with us today. And we so appreciate our work with university hospitals, and we really look forward to more on the Alliance. So yeah. Thanks so much. And
Jennifer, just one closing statement is to say, I hope that the tech companies took some of this because we can't forget that we have a $1 trillion problem. Healthcare is the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy, and there's so much needless suffering and inequities in healthcare. And I think the solutions are going to come from the partnerships that I described, but the tech people in the audience are a big part of that. So I hope you take it in earnest and work to solve these problems with us. Thank you.
Well, thanks. It feels so promising. So we're great to hear your, it's so nice to hear your positive outlook for this. So thanks again, Dr. Pronovost. And we're going to move on to the second half now with the startups.
Perfect.
All right. Take care.